American history. President Dwight Eisenhower. President Dwight Eisenhower, January 1953 – January 1961. Eisenhower was born on October 14, 1890 in Denison, Texas, to David Jacob Eisenhower and Ida Elizabeth Stover Eisenhower. In 1911, Eisenhower landed an appointment to the United States Military Academy in West Point, New York, where attendance was free of charge. In 1915, Eisenhower proudly graduated from West Point and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. In 1942, he was promoted to Major General. Just months later, he became Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Forces and led Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed U.S. Army Chief of Staff in 1945. He became the first Supreme Allied Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1951. In 1952, he was elected U.S. 34th President, defeating the Democratic Party candidate Stevenson Adlai. He served 2 terms before retiring to Gettysburg in 1961. The domestic policies of Dwight Eisenhower. President Eisenhower's domestic policy was known as modern republicanism, which meant that the federal government would reduce participation in providing social services and management of the economy. Under modern republicanism, the government was to do the following: to reduce expenditure to encourage a free market economy, to make the state take over the responsibilities of social services like health, education, and housing, to come up with a balanced budget, to cut taxes, to solve the problem of the spread of communism, to end red tape bureaucracy. The implementation of modern republicanism. The USA was to continue with its international obligations. However, the Allies were expected to make financial contributions in matters of containing communism, maintaining peace and security. This was to help USA reduce her government expenditure with a view to come up with a balanced budget. The president ended wage and price control system. He reintroduced a free market economy. However, this led to unemployment in USA. His government was criticized for neglecting the medical care, the poor and the old. He introduced the Federal Griffin Act, and under this law, the government fought corruption and communism. This law authorized the Federal Bureau of Investigations (FBI) to investigate public officers and ministers suspected of corruption. Out of this effort, press advisor B. Adam was caught. He set up a program to cut down military expenditure, which was done by withdrawing the 7th Fleet, which was guarding Taiwan against Red China. This helped the government to guard against deficit financing. He tried to restore responsibility and morality in the public service. Civil servants found to be lacking in behavior and character, like those who had taken to drunkenness, drug abuse, mental illness, and those involved in sexual scandals, were dismissed. American history. President Dwight Eisenhower. His other distinction included signing the 1957 Civil Rights Act and setting up a permanent Civil Rights Commission. This was the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction. However, Congress amended the bill and critically weakened its effectiveness. Eisenhower initiated the Federal Highway Program of 1956. Eisenhower championed and signed a bill that authorized the interstate highway system in 1956. He justified the project through the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 as essential to American security during the Cold War. It was believed that large cities would be targets in a possible war, so the highways were designed to facilitate their evacuation and ease military maneuvers. Under this program, the government spent a lot of money to come up with a road network to link up major cities, which boosted the sale of automobiles, and it became the main means of transport for the first time in USA. He established Alaska and Hawaii as states within the Federation USA. The most remarkable achievement of Eisenhower was to make USA larger when new states were added to the Union, and they included Alaska and Hawaii, and this expanded the Union to 50 states. Eisenhower was additionally responsible for signing the bill to form the National Aeronautics and Space Administration (NASA). In response to USSR Sputnik I, a spacecraft that was launched in October 1957 to orbit the Earth, Eisenhower created NASA as a civilian space agency in October 1958, signed a landmark science education law, and improved relations with American scientists. Eisenhower balanced the American budget not just once but 3 times. Despite much pressure to do otherwise, he also refused to cut taxes and raise defense spending. His fiscal policy contributed to the prosperity of the 1950s. He kept America at peace throughout his tenure. Eisenhower was confronted with major Cold War crises every year he was in office: Korea, Vietnam, Formosa, Suez Crisis, Hungary, Berlin, and the Humanist II incident. While more than once America seemed on the brink of war, Eisenhower always kept a level head. He dealt calmly and rationally with each situation, always finding a solution that avoided war without diminishing America's prestige. However, the great general left office accused of poor economic policies during the second term of office. He is remembered for unemployment and neglecting the poor. Foreign policies. His foreign policy was affected by the problem of continuous wars outside America, which included the Korean War, the Indochina Wars and the 1956 Suez Canal War, among others. Therefore, his foreign policy included the following. He inherited the Korean War of 1950–1953, which was caused by his predecessor. In July 1953, he initiated an armistice that ended the war, though it cost USA around 140,000 lives and over $250 billion. Besides, USA failed to get total victory, and thus was a disappointment to the capitalist world. In July 1953, an armistice took effect, with Korea being divided along approximately the same boundary 38 parallel as in 1950. The armistice and boundary remain in effect up to today. This armistice that ended the Korean War has been viewed as the greatest achievement of the Eisenhower administration in foreign affairs. The Eisenhower administration continued with the Truman administration's policy of containment, which called American history. President Dwight Eisenhower became a Soviet satellite state, and therefore when Eisenhower came to power, he continued to sponsor 8% of the total cost of the Vietnam War. However, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France was defeated while American troops were captured and many others died. The Eisenhower administration played a role in the partition of Vietnam at the 1954 Geneva Conference, and the U.S. subsequently directed aid to the newly formed country of South Vietnam. Eisenhower came up with the program of Southeast Asian Treaty Organization (SEATO), which was to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. In September 1954, SEATO was established at Manila, Philippines, by Britain, France, and New Zealand, among other countries. Eisenhower tried to reduce the nuclear war threats using the Geneva spirit. At this time, the two superpowers USA and USSR had developed and accumulated a lot of deadly nuclear weapons which threatened world peace. He suggested that the most important move under the Geneva spirit was to convince Nikita Khrushchev to sign a peace treaty. There was a major uprising that broke out in Hungary in 1956, but the Eisenhower administration did not become directly involved, but condemned the Soviet military response. As part of a move towards détente, Eisenhower sought to reach a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, but the 1960 Humanist II incident derailed the Cold War summit in Paris. He had a strong policy towards the Middle East, where he withdrew financial support from Aswan High Dam project to discipline Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. This was because of President Nasser's leaning towards the East USSR. Eisenhower, however, tried to maintain friendship with Arabs, yet at the same time protecting Israel. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, sparking off the Suez crisis, in which a coalition of France, Britain, and Israel took control of the canal. Concerned about the economic and political impacts of the invasion, Eisenhower pressurized Britain and France to withdraw. In addition, he came up with the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1956, and under it the president was allowed to use force anywhere in the Middle East against any country controlled by communism. The doctrine also advanced the view that any country in the Middle East could request American economic assistance or aid from U.S. military forces against communism. The Cuban Revolution broke out during Eisenhower's second term, resulting in the replacement of a pro-U.S. president Fulgencio Batista with Fidel Castro, a known communist. In response to the revolution, the Eisenhower administration broke ties with Cuba and began preparations for an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles, ultimately resulting in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion after Eisenhower had left office. The Cold War escalated during his presidency. When the Soviet Union successfully tested a hydrogen bomb in late November 1955, Eisenhower decided to initiate a disarmament proposal to the Soviets. In an attempt to make their refusal more difficult, he proposed that both sides agree to dedicate fissionable nuclear material away from weapons to peaceful uses such as power generation. This approach was labeled Atoms for Peace. On 1 May 1960, a United States Humanist II spy plane was shot down by the Soviet Air Defense Forces while performing photographic aerial reconnaissance deep into Soviet territory. The Humanist II plane, flown by pilot Francis Gary Powers, was hit by an Menace-75 surface-to-air missile and crashed near Sverdlovsk. Francis Gary Powers parachuted safely, but he was captured. The incident occurred during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was forced to admit the mission's true purpose after the Soviet government produced the captured pilot. And American history, President Dwight Eisenhower. The civil rights movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s for blacks and other disadvantaged groups to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. Whereas the American Civil War had officially abolished slavery, it didn't end discrimination against blacks. They continued to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By the mid-20th century, African Americans had had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many whites, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned 2 decades. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was the first civil rights organization in the United States, formed in 1909 as a biracial endeavor to advance justice for African Americans by a group including W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, Moorfield Story and Howard B. Wells. Its mission was to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate race-based discrimination. Its activities included political lobbying, publicity efforts, and litigation strategies developed by its legal team. The group enlarged its mission in the late 20th century by considering issues such as police misconduct, the status of black foreign refugees, and questions of economic development. Prior to World War II, most blacks were low-wage farmers, factory workers, and domestic servants. By the early 1940s, war-related work was booming, but most blacks were not given the better-paying jobs. They were also discouraged from joining the military. After thousands of blacks threatened to march on Washington, D.C. to demand equal employment rights, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 on June 25, 1941. It opened national defense jobs and other government jobs to all Americans regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin. Black men and women served heroically in World War II, despite suffering segregation and discrimination. During their deployment, the Tuskegee Airmen broke the racial barrier to become the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps and earn more than 150 distinguished flying crosses. Yet many black veterans met with prejudice upon returning home. As the Cold War began, President Harry Truman initiated the civil rights agenda, and in 1948 issued Executive Order 9981 to end discrimination in the military. These events helped set the stage for grassroots initiatives to enact racial equality legislation and incite the civil rights movement. On December 1, 1955, a 42-year-old woman named Rosa Parks found a seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus after work. Segregation laws at the time stated blacks must sit in designated seats at the back of the bus, and Parks had complied. When a white man got on the bus and could not find a seat in the white section at the front of the bus driver instructed Parks and 3 other blacks to give up their seats. Parks refused and was arrested. As word of her arrest ignited outrage and support, Parks unwittingly became the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. Black community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, led by Baptist minister Martin Luther King Jr., a role which would place him at the center in the fight for civil rights. Parks' courage incited the MIA to stage a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. On November 14, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated seating was unconstitutional. In 1954, the civil rights movement gained momentum when the United States Supreme Court made segregation illegal in public schools in the case of Brown v. Education. This was a landmark in the struggle for civil rights because it was to mark the end of segregation in schools and other public places. American history. President Dwight Eisenhower. On September 9, 1957, President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law, the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It allowed federal prosecution of anyone who tried to prevent someone from voting. It also created a commission to investigate voter fraud. On May 24, 1961, a group of Freedom Riders reached Jackson, Mississippi. Though met with hundreds of supporters, the group was arrested for trespassing in a whites-only facility and sentenced to 30 days in jail. Attorneys lawyers for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People NAACP brought the matter to the U.S. Supreme Court, who reversed the convictions. Hundreds of new Freedom Riders were drawn to the cause, and the rides continued. Arguably one of the most famous events of the civil rights movement took place on August 28, 1963, the March on Washington. It was organized and attended by civil rights leaders such as Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King Jr. More than 200,000 people, black and white, congregated in Washington, D.C. for a peaceful march with the main purpose of forcing civil rights legislation and establishing job equality for everyone. The highlight of the march was King's speech, in which he continually stated, "I have a dream." King's "I have a dream" speech quickly became a slogan for equality and freedom. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a legislation initiated by President John F. Kennedy before his assassination. It was signed into law on July 2 of that year. King and other civil rights activists witnessed the signing. The law guaranteed equal employment for all, limited the use of voter literacy tests, and allowed federal authorities to ensure that all public facilities were integrated. When President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law on August 6, 1965, he took the Civil Rights Act of 1964 several steps further. The new law banned all voter literacy tests and provided federal examiners in certain voting jurisdictions. It also allowed the Attorney General to contest state and local poll taxes. As a result, poll taxes were later declared unconstitutional in Harper, Virginia State Board of Elections in 1966. The civil rights movement had tragic consequences for two of its leaders in the late 1960s. On February 21, 1965, Organization of Afro-American Unity founder Malcolm X was assassinated at a rally. On April 4, 1968, civil rights leader and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at his hotel room's balcony. Emotionally charged looting and riots followed, putting even more pressure on the Johnson administration to push through additional civil rights laws. The Fair Housing Act became law on April 11, 1968, just days after King's assassination. It prohibited housing,